Hello, you're on the channel Infidelity and Revenge. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can do it right now. Enjoy watching. You wouldn't believe that such an insignificant thing as a single letter of the alphabet can have such great significance. But it all depends on the context. One evening I was sitting at our table going over my daughter Marilyn's medical forms. She was about to go to kindergarten, so the pediatrician had given her a complete checkup, and my wife had left the forms lying on the table. As I looked at them, I saw the letter that ended my marriage. In the column labeled blood type it read A. I froze, for about 10 seconds, a minute, I have no idea. Then I went to the cabinet and pulled out 2 pieces of paper from our medical records. Last summer, my wife and I had donated blood to the Red Cross, who had given each of us a receipt indicating our blood type. Here it was, on 2 sheets of paper, mine was B, hers was A. So there's no way Marilyn was my daughter. If my wife was her mother, and I saw Dolly give birth to her, then someone with type A had to be the father. The kids were already asleep, Dolly was upstairs watching TV. I got a beer out of the fridge and sat in the backyard, thinking. How was my marriage going? I would say, good. Pretty typical. Both good and bad. Depends on which day you ask. When we were dating and in the first few months of our marriage, Dolly and I were passionately in love. We made love all the time, sometimes madly, and even outside of bed we were constantly touching each other, holding hands, walking hand in hand, stroking each other's necks or backs as we passed. Of course, after a while it faded away. Isn't that what happens in every marriage? But now that proof of her infidelity had hit me right between the eyes, everything I had ever thought about our marriage was on the rocks. I sat and thought. What had changed, gradually or suddenly? It seemed to be both. For a while, the slowing down of our sex life was gradual. But about 6 years ago, that is, a few months before Marilyn was conceived, there had been a few strange months. Dolly, my open, loving and affectionate wife, was behaving very strangely. One evening she came home from work quite late, briefly allowed me to kiss her gently, went straight into the shower and avoided me for the rest of the evening. The next morning was the same, cold and unceremonious. But that night she was different. She came home early, made a special dinner, put me to bed early, and lovingly fucked me half to death. She sucked my cock for a long time, which she didn't usually do, and then we made love twice, with an eagerness and excitement I thought we had lost. We cuddled happily before bed, and Dolly told me how much she loved me. Several more times that week we had passionate sex. Then the cold night soon repeated itself. She came home late from work, not a word to me, and a quick shower. For the next 2 months, I hardly knew who I had married. Dolly was passionate and loving, Dolly was cold. Dolly was attentive, Dolly was aloof and preoccupied. Dolly was patient, Dolly was obnoxious and testy. I asked her several times if something was wrong, if something was bothering her between us, if there was a problem at work. But all I got in response was, I don't know, Jack, I guess I'm just a little nervous. Sorry. When things finally got back on track after 3 months or so, she was much less pleasant than she had been at the beginning of our marriage. Dolly had become less cranky, but she was almost never sweet and loving anymore. And her interest in sex seemed to disappear. We made love no more than once a week, sometimes no more than once a fortnight, and only when I asked quite firmly. Any gentle request, such as, maybe we could fool around tonight, was met with a curt refusal. I had to seriously point out how long it had been since we had done that, then Dolly would have sex with me, but in a way that made it clear she was just doing me a favor. Do all marriages work out in such a sad pattern? This was the only marriage I knew well, so I couldn't tell. Of course, I wondered what was going on, and my musings included the possibility of an affair. But shortly thereafter, Dolly became pregnant, and our shared excitement about the baby-to-be and the joy of having our wonderful Marilyn pushed most of my worries about our marriage out of my mind. After Marilyn was born, Dolly and I were tired all the time, so her lack of interest in sex was easier to understand, although I still wasn't happy about it. And when Marilyn turned 3, Dolly got pregnant again, and we gave birth to Brendan just after Marilyn's 4th birthday. And so Jack and Dolly, lovers and spouses, became Jack and Dolly, parents of 2 wonderful, exhausting children. We both adored our children, and although I realize now that I was deeply unhappy about the state of our marriage and our virtual lack of a sex life, I didn't consciously realize it at the time. Or if I did, I just assumed it was what all couples with young children go through. Now, armed with the shocking knowledge that my daughter wasn't mine, the events of 6 years ago didn't seem so mysterious. Dolly must have had an affair around that time. That explained the cold and the sudden escape to the shower. The passionate sex and warm affection in the days that followed could be put down to guilt or even, if I was charitable, a determination to keep her marriage happy by continuing the affair. As I sat in the courtyard, watching the darkness fall and the stars grow brighter, my inner shock gave way to growing anger. Not only had my loving wife given me horns, but she had given me someone else's child to raise. And maybe not just one, maybe Brendan wasn't mine either. If all I had thought about at that moment was punishing Dolly, I would have stormed into the house, confronted her with proof of her blood type, forced her to confess, and thrown the lying bitch out on the street. But that was difficult. I adored my children whether they were biologically mine or not. If we divorced, Dolly would probably get sole custody as soon as it turned out they weren't mine. I sat there thinking. I asked the question, what do I want? And the answers were surprisingly clear. Firstly, I want to know exactly what Dolly did. Was it a brief affair? Does she not even know that Marilyn is not my child? Or does she know everything and has been screwing some guy behind my back for years? And secondly, I want to raise my children as my own and never let them know I'm not their father. Once I knew what my goals were, planning how to get there seemed surprisingly easy. I went back into the house and found cotton swabs. As I went into each of the children's rooms, I carefully took a swab from the inside of each of their cheeks, without waking them up, and wrapped each one separately. I gave Marilyn a 2 and Brendan a 3. Then I went down to the kitchen, put the swab to my cheek and wrote the number 1 on it. I had a friend who worked in a chemistry lab at the university and I arranged for him to test the DNA for me. That was the first step, the beginning of gathering information. When I got my first response, I knew what I was going to do next. A week later, I received a phone call from a friend of mine. He didn't know whose samples they were. I told him I'd met people with the same surname and we were trying to find out if we were distant relatives. "Hi, Jack," he said. "Your 2 and 3 are definitely related, they're siblings. But your 1 is not related to either of them. I guess these people aren't your cousins after all." I thanked him and hung up. So, Marilyn and Brendan were brother and sister, meaning they shared the same parents. Dolly had 2 kids with this mystery jerk. But did she know that? Obviously, she knew she was sleeping with this guy, but did she know he was the father of our kids? There was an easy way to find out. I went into the kitchen where Dolly was doing the dishes. "Honey, I want to ask you something," I began. Without turning round, she told me to go ahead and I continued. "A colleague of mine at work has a biologist friend who does some DNA research, and he needs samples from people who are related. I told him I would swab you, me, and each of the kids. I'll do each of the kids now before bedtime and then you and I will do ours later, okay?" I watched Dolly very carefully as I told my story. Halfway through, she tensed up and almost dropped the pot she was washing. Then she came to her senses and continued washing. When I finished speaking, there was silence for a moment, and then she turned and looked at me. "I'm not sure I like that idea, Jack. How will we know what this biologist is going to do with the samples, or will our information be kept secret?" I started to disagree with her, but she literally came at me. "No, I'm just not crazy about the idea. Please tell your colleague we don't want to be involved." "Okay, honey," I said softly. "It's no big deal anyway." Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. My next step was to find out everything I could about her affair or love affairs. Who, where and when. Maybe even why. I wasn't sure of that, but it was entirely possible that Dolly had something hidden somewhere in the house that would give me a clue. But I would need time to search thoroughly. That Saturday we were going to go to her parents' house to spend the afternoon there. A few minutes before we were due to leave, I went into the bedroom, called our house on my mobile phone, then picked up the receiver and pretended I was talking to my boss from work. When I finished, I walked over to Dolly. "Darling, I'm sorry. There's a crisis at work, and they absolutely need me today, at least for 4 hours. Otherwise, the company is in serious trouble. Damn it, Jack, my parents are looking forward to seeing the kids." "I know," I said soothingly. "I'm really sorry about that. You go ahead, just apologize for me. You and the kids will have a good time and I'll make myself some dinner and I'll see you tonight." She accepted this change in her plans without further objection and was soon in the car with the kids. I now had a few hours to systematically search the house. I decided that there wasn't much point in searching the house, the places I usually went, since Dolly was unlikely to hide anything there. So I skipped the kitchen, the bookshelves in the living room, and so on. I also ignored my parts of the bedroom and bathroom, but thoroughly checked all her parts of the wardrobe and dresser drawers. All that surprised me, there were a couple of very sexy items of lingerie that I had never seen her wearing before. They were hidden far in the far corner, under everyday items, so she didn't want me to know about them. That left only the children's rooms and the attic. Deciding that the children's rooms were less likely, I climbed into the attic. There were various old and long-forgotten pieces of furniture, a couple of lamps and a few boxes of books and things that dated back to before we were married. It was too much to check out, so I looked around carefully first. I noticed that one of the 3 boxes off to the side looked less dusty than the others. Looking at them more closely, I saw that they had been picked up and moved more recently than the rest of the attic junk, which apparently hadn't been touched in years. So, I devoted my attention to the 3 drawers and found everything I was looking for. It was all Dolly's old stuff, mostly letters from friends and mates from college days. I also found a stack of letters and mementos from myself, sweet greeting cards, that sort of thing. Quite far down at the bottom of one of the boxes, obviously meant to be hidden by old papers, was a thin stack of more recent notes and 2 videotapes. I pulled them out. The cassettes were unlabeled, the notes were from Steve, and they were brief but blatantly erotic. I carried the notes and videotapes downstairs to take a closer look. 20 minutes with a pile of notes told me almost everything I needed to know. Dolly was fucking Steve Fisher, her boss at the office where she worked. The affair had begun, it seemed to me, about 3 months before Marilyn's conception, just as Dolly was behaving so strangely and promiscuously at home. The notes were all from Steve to Dolly, and they were rough and strong. There was no love in them, but there was a lot of lust. From the beginning, the relationship seemed almost domineering, submissive, with Steve calling the shots. Some notes told her how to dress for certain occasions, coming to work without panties on a certain day, or wearing a sexy tank top without a bra under her blouse. Others described how he would take her from behind the next time they stayed late at work, or ordered her to come to his office the next day at 10 a.m. and take off all her clothes. A couple of notes congratulated her on the birth of their children and contemptuously called me a poor fool who, without knowing it, was raising them for him. It was clear he had no intention of claiming his children. I knew he was happily married to a lovely woman named Claire, and they had 3 children of their own. Apparently Claire was as much in the dark about his affair as I was. My jaw clenched as I read. It was clear that Steve was dominating Dolly, but she had gone along with it willingly. There was no hint of rape or blackmail. She seemed to enjoy playing the role of slut for him and being told what to do. Besides, it was obvious that they both knew who the father of Dolly's 2 children was, and they both seemed to enjoy the secret knowledge they had over me. I could learn nothing about Dolly from these notes, but there was no doubt now that she had fooled me for over 6 years and deliberately had children with another man while pretending to be my loving wife. One note made it clear that Steve had ordered Dolly to cut me off from sex. She had not fully complied and he was angry about it. He wrote, "I agreed to let you sleep with your loser husband once a week so he wouldn't suspect anything. But last week you seemed to have slept with him twice. So I'm punishing you, you can't have sex with him again for a fortnight. During that time, you will not have an orgasm with me. And no masturbation, slut. If you don't do what I tell you, you will lose access to my cock forever. I'd been full of anger for days, but these notes had brought me to a boil. My plans for revenge against Dolly had to include Steve. I thought for a moment, then took the tapes to the VCR and watched. Both were taped of Steve and Dolly having sex. The earlier one, judging by Dolly's haircut, was taken in a room I didn't recognize, probably Steve's house. The more recent one was taken in my own bedroom. I wondered when Dolly had had the opportunity, and it occurred to me that I'd had several business trips over the past year, and perhaps she'd left the children with her parents. Overall, the tone of the recordings confirmed Steve's sexual dominance over Dolly and her passionate willingness to submit. The lighting was not as bright, although they were both clearly distinguishable, but the sound was surprisingly good and I could hear every word, every moan and groan. On the first film, from the very beginning of their affair, I could hear Steve giving commands. Their sex was rough, not tender or affectionate, and he spoke roughly to her, ordering her around and calling her a slut. I was sad to see that Dolly was clearly enjoying what he was doing to her. Her arousal was obvious, she was moaning and thrashing wildly, obviously coming several times before he would come. The second tape had almost the same sex scenes, but some interesting new dialogue. They were lying on the bed recovering from another contraction. Dolly asked Steve why he didn't mind me raising his children, and he replied, "Jack is a nice enough guy, and from what you say, he loves kids. I have 3 of them and I have nothing else to worry about. If it wasn't for that," he continued, "I'd just tell you to keep him. What's he good for, apart from changing nappies?" "It's not fair, Steve," Dolly said. "Jack is a good and sweet man. He genuinely loved me and has been a great provider for me and the kids. And that's why you've let me do whatever I want to you all these years, right?" She smiled at him and punched him lightly on the arm. "You bastard, you know that. You've never been as gentle and kind to me as Jack, and that's probably why you turn me on like he never did. Yeah, baby, I treat you like a whore. Now get on your knees and I'll take you from behind before I have to leave." When I finished watching both films, I sat down and thought. What brazen jerks they both were. Not only for making those tapes, but for having the stupidity to leave them where I could find them. My revenge would be total, and it would be on both of them. I used a scanner to scan each note onto my hard drive. Then, using some fancy software I borrowed from work for a project I did last summer, I converted each of the videotapes into a digital file on my hard drive so I could go back to them later to edit them. Once finished, I took the tapes and cassettes to the boot of my car, hiding them under the spare wheel. Finally, I cleaned up the attic, arranging everything neatly so Dolly wouldn't realize I'd been there. Over the next fortnight I systematically made and carried out my plans. It was much easier than I had expected to be completely false to Dolly, to act as if nothing unusual had happened. It occurred to me that she had been deceiving me for 6 years, so why should it be difficult for me to do the same to her? So I was sweet and loving, took care of the kids, was affectionate with Dolly as I had been, and even asked her for sex a couple of times. But I tried to do it gently so that it would be easier for her to tell me no. I really had no desire to touch her ever again. The big day in Dolly's life was approaching. She had been elected the new president of a major charitable foundation in our town, and would officially take office at a luncheon where she would give a speech outlining the foundation's plans for the coming year. Dolly has served on the charity's board for 3 years and her appointment as president was a great honor. She was nervous about her presentation and asked me to help make a PowerPoint piece that she planned to use. This was my golden opportunity. For a week or so I worked with her every night, letting her show me her slides and other materials and organizing them into a flowing presentation. She practiced this several times a month before her big night, and it always went well. At the same time, I had made my own, completely different PowerPoint presentation, and she was ready to replace it. The evening before dinner, I deleted Dolly's file and put mine in its place. I also added a lock so that once the file started working, she wouldn't be able to disable it. All I had to do was make sure that Dolly invited Steve Fisher and his wife to dinner. I nonchalantly asked her. Yes, she said they would be there. That big night I was as excited as Dolly was, though for different reasons. We got there early. Dolly, elegantly dressed in a black evening gown, looked stunning. I helped her set up her laptop and did a couple of tests to make sure it would play. We all enjoyed a nice dinner and some opening remarks. Then the outgoing president warmly introduced Dolly and she came to the podium looking shy but proud as everyone applauded. She began to speak and started the PowerPoint file. At first it behaved as she expected, showing pictures of the society's key charitable projects, followed by pie charts showing income and expenditure. Then, as I had planned, he suddenly changed the subject. First was a series of still photographs, shots I'd selected from 2 videos, of a couple having sex in different poses. Some of the photos were a little dark, but the overall impression of 10 or 12 of them confirmed that these were Dolly and Steve. Several of them showed them having sex in different positions. Dolly continued talking about key social affairs for a few minutes, then, noticing a sudden murmur from the audience, turned round and looked at the screen behind her. She aghast and with a sharp movement of her hand knocked the water glass over onto the podium. For a moment she stood motionless, in complete shock. Then a bright red blush quickly covered her entire face and neck, and she began frantically pressing buttons on her laptop, desperately hoping the file would stop playing. By then the still pictures had been replaced by short video clips. In one, Steve was busily working Dolly from behind while we heard her moaning, "Fuck me, you bastard, come on, fuck me." The next, they were lying naked on the bed together. "How are you gonna stop Jack from knowing I knocked you up? As long as I give him a little sex every now and then, he won't suspect a thing." And Steve said, "But not too much, baby, you belong to me." There were 2 or 3 more clips, but by then it was all clear. Finally the screen went out. A commotion went up in the room. There was laughter and hooting from all the tables. Dolly stood there in utter shock and disbelief, too stunned at this point to even be embarrassed. At a neighboring table, Claire, Steve's wife, picked up a vase of flowers, smashed it over Steve's head and left the room. Amidst the laughter and shouts, people gradually left the ballroom, looking back at Dolly, gesturing to each other as they reenacted the amazing scene. Surprisingly soon Dolly and I were alone. She stood, defeated and lost, at the podium. I sat at a table 10 feet away from her, smiling broadly and looking up at her from below. Finally she raised her eyes and looked at me with an expression of terrible sadness. "Jack, how could you do this to me? I thought you loved me." Under the circumstances, I found her question amusing. I burst into a burst of laughter and, still laughing, walked out the door. To be continued. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to rate the video and leave your comment.